Oktavia Ramadhani, and in this video I will introduce you to one of the classic British poets, John Donne, and give you an interpretation of one of his famous works. So please enjoy the video. In an age of plagues, persecution, and profound faith, one poet dared to question death itself, and left behind a legacy of divine beauty. John Donne was born in London 1572 into a Roman Catholic family at a time when Catholics faced discrimination in Protestant England. Brilliant and rebellious, he studied at Oxford and Cambridge but couldn't graduate due to religious restrictions. Later, he studied law at Lincoln's Inn and lived the high life of Elizabethan society, writing witty, sensual poems and exploring love, philosophy, and faith. But Donne's life took a sharp turn. In 1601, he secretly married Anne More, the 17-year-old niece of his employer. When the marriage was discovered, it ignited a scandal that reverberated through the social and political circles of London. Donne was imprisoned in the Fleet prison for a brief period. Despite the harsh consequences, Donne never regretted his choice. Their marriage, though marked by poverty and Donne's stalled career, was deeply affectionate. Over 16 years, Anne bore him 12 children, though only a few would survive infancy. Then sadly, in 1617, Anne died at just 33 years old, likely due to complications from childbirth. Her death shattered Donne. He never remarried, and her absence would echo throughout his later writings. In the years following Anne's death, Donne's life took a dramatic spiritual turn. The same depth of feeling he once poured into love poems now shaped his religious meditations. He began to see suffering not as punishment but as crucible for the soul. By 1621, he became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. His final sermon, titled Death's Duel, was delivered in February of 1631, just weeks before his passing on March 31st of that same year. It wasn't just another sermon. It was a farewell message, a powerful and deeply personal reflection on life, suffering, and the soul's journey beyond death. Shortly after delivering that sermon, Donne passed away. Unfittingly, he was laid to rest right there, in St. Paul's Cathedral, the very place he had preached so many of his passionate metaphysical sermons. Beneath the cathedral floor stands the statue of John Donne, designed by Donne himself before his death. Is wrapped in a burial shroud, standing upright, eyes lifted toward heaven, not in fear, but in hope. Even in stone, Donne looks beyond death. And perhaps nothing captures his legacy more powerfully than the words of one of his contemporaries who wrote, "No man is better known in London than John Donne. His voice moves the hearts of sinners and saints alike." Now, let's explore some of his famous works. Imagine a man trying to woo women by talking about the flea that just bit them both. Strange? That's The Flea. Written in the 1590s, it's bold, it's cheeky, and it showcases Donne's signature, turning something ordinary into something wildly philosophical. Though written decades earlier, it wasn't published until 1633, after Donne's death, when the Myers compiled his manuscripts into a printed collection. In 1611, Donne prepared to leave his wife for a long journey, but instead of despair, he left her with a poem. A valediction forbidding mourning speaks of love that doesn't rely on physical closeness. Around 1609, Donne began writing what became known as the Holy Sonnets, a series of 19 poems grappling with sin, salvation, and mortality. They too were published after his death in 1633, proof that his spiritual journey lived on through his words. What if love could make you a saint? In a conversation, Donne turns romantic passion into something sacred. Here, Donne does what he does best, blurring the lines between heaven and earth. And finally, Death's Duel. This wasn't a poem, but a sermon, preached in February 1631, just weeks before Donne died. Just as he had lived, questioning, searching, and speaking truth through beauty. In this part, I'm going to introduce one of John Donne's most powerful poems from his Holy Sonnet Poems collection, Death, Be Not Proud. Don't start strong. He says, you may think you're scary, but you're not. Just because people fear death doesn't mean death is actually mighty. Here he says, when someone dies, death hasn't really won. Why? Because the soul lives on. Death might take the body, but not the person. He compares death to rest and sleep, things we often enjoy. If sleep brings comfort, then death must bring even more peace. He reminds us that good people often die young, but that's not a tragedy. Their souls are set free. Death isn't in control. It shows up when fate decides, or when rulers command it, or when people take their own lives. Death is just a servant, dragged around by war, disease, and violence. Death isn't in control. It shows up when fate decides, or when rulers command it, or when people take their own lives. Death is just a servant, dragged around by war, disease, and violence. After that short sleep of death, we wake up into eternal life, and in that moment, death itself disappears forever. Death dies. Now that we have already uncovered the poem, let's take a closer look at what makes Death, Be Not Proud such a powerful and timeless piece. The poem is officially titled Holy Sonnet 10, written by John Donne around 1609, and published after his death in 1633. It is a metaphysical sonnet combining deep philosophical ideas with strong emotions. At its core, this poem challenges the traditional fear of death. Donne boldly claims that death is not the end. The tone starts bold and defiant, and for the mood, it begins with confrontation and ends in peace. Donne uses strong, simple imagery. He links death to things like bones, poison, war, and opium. To drive his point home, Donne uses personification, treating death like a proud, arrogant person who's about to be humbled, a metaphor comparing death to sleep, a short rest before waking to eternal life. John Donne didn't just write poems, he challenged ideas. In a time where death was everywhere, he refused to see it as the final word. His poetry dares us to believe in something greater, to speak boldly even when afraid, to see beyond the shadows and find light. So the next time you feel the weight of time or fear of the unknown, remember Donne's words, "Death, thou shalt die." Because for those who believe, death is not the end, it's the beginning of forever.